हेलो फ्रेंड्स, केजी क्लासेस में आपका स्वागत है। आज हम आपको जॉन कीट्स के लॉन्ग आंसर के बारे में बताएंगे। क्वेश्चन है, गिव द क्रिटिकल अप्रिसिएशन ऑफ द पोएम ओडे ऑन ए ग्रेसियन अर्न। आंसर फर्स्ट हेडिंग है द ओकेजन ऑफ द पोएम। द ओड on a Grecian urn was writing in the spring of 1819. It could not have been inspired by any single urn because no known urn of antiquity portrays both a Bacchanalian procession, a, a scene of dancing, singing, and merry-making, and a pastoral sacrifice. Keats must have imagined the urn he describes by a mental combination of subjects derived from different urn beaks, suggests that the inspiration for this ode must have been partly derived from a marble urn belonging to Lord Holland and still preserved at his residence. This urn has carved on it the sense of a pastoral sacrifice in outline, and of course no subject is commoner in Greek sculpture than a Bacchanalian procession. Keats combines both these scenes on the imagery urn described by him in the ode. The poem was also recited by Keats in course of a walk with Haydn through the Malvern Meadows in a deep and thrilling chant. It was published in January 1820. Heading is sources of the poem. The poem developed from many sources. The first by the poet's vision of a Greek vase having some figures engraved on it. This urn, said to be Lord Holland's urn, represents the scene of a sacrifice. An altar bearing fruits is carved in the midst. Nearby stands a priest, and above is a figure playing on a pipe. Other details recalling Keats' conception are two trees and a bull that is brought to be slain. But the poem was a result of Keats' very long contemplation from the time when he wrote. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. His love of grief, art, his sense of the nearness of pain and pleasure, of the contrast between the stormy nature of the passion and the severity of the ideal, of the charm of the old pagan worship, all are blended here. By instance, meditation on a thing of beauty, Keats rises to the inspired affirmation of the last two lines. Heading is the subject and theme of the poem. The theme of the ode, of course, is the human and the mutable on the one hand, the immortal and essential on the other. A first sight, Keats' theme in the ode to a nightingale and ode on a Grecian urn cannot be distinguished. The theme in both is the belief that whereas the brief experience of beauty is fleeting, the embodiment of the same experience in art, marble, or song is a source of joy, and it never perishes. Thus this ode also be his other odes is a hymn of triumph to some extent. The solace of romance is exchanged for the solace of art in the ode on a Grecian urn. Human life and happiness may be brief, yet art may enshrine them with an ideal beauty that outlives the years. The figures and all they symbolized are gone, but art has given them a lasting durability and so links the ages together. The Grecian urn is the happiest stroke of invention, the sudden and surprising detachment of beauty from the flow of time and change. In the words of Sidney Colvin, the main theme of the poem is the vital difference between life, which pays for its unique prerogative of reality by satiety and decay, and art which is forfeiting reality gains in exchange permanence of beauty and the power to charm by imagined experience even richer than the real. Heading a spiritual sublimation from the drowsed intoxication of the sense, the poet rises to a glorious, clean-eyed apprehension of the spiritual eternity which art with its unheard melodies afford. The three consummate central stanzas have themselves the impassioned serenity of great sculpture. Only less novel are the splendid imagery of the opening and the immortal paradox of the close. Heading a development of thought, Keats addressed the urn. What is the legend which is carved on its side? He passes to direct consideration of the sculptured legend, the flute player, the youth singer under trees, the lovers about to kiss. Stanza first. The carven life, the silent music of the marble pipes, the love that never reaches fruition, all this life of imagery and imagination is more real and more inviolable than a human life of audible melody and tangible embrace. The fruition of human love never bring real happiness. Stanza 2. What the urn loses in reality, it gains in permanence. The lovers are forever young on the urn. Stanza 3. Hitherto Keats has confined himself to the actual figures on the urn. In this stanza, he not only animates the marble but goes beyond it to create a whole landscape of river and seashore and city in which the carven figures can live and move. There is a perfect picture of a sacrificial holiday. There is a ting of sorrow because the street forever will silent be. The inhabitants of the little town can never return to tell why thou art desolate. Stanza 4. Then Keats draw the moral of the urn, which is also the moral of his life work. That is, the generation of men pass and die, but beauty and truth not two things, not even twin things, but one and the same things seen from different aspects are permanent forever. In the form of art, they live permanently. Stanza 5th. Heading its critical interpretation. The poem is remarkable for two things. First, it is the poet's maturest, almost final word on his vision of Hellas, Greek life, culture and art, and second, it has been interpreted in quite different way and has given rise to endless controversy. Robert Bridge criticized the ode as having only one static idea. He finds no development of thought in it and says the poem is unprogressive, monotonous and scattered, the attention being called to fresh details without result. But according to C.M. Browra, the poem has a beginning, a middle and an end. In the first stanza we have the introduction. In the second, third and fourth we get the exposition of the main theme, and in the fifth the conclusion. The ode opens with an invocation and the urn is referred to as the unravaged bridge of quietness. Thus, the urn is a symbol of calm response and timelessness. The two opening lines together constitute one of those rich passages which have been described Rossetti as the pillar of Hercules of the human language. Then follows a string of questions which are at the same time pictures. What men or gods are these? What maidens loth? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? The poet then proceeds to answer the questions in the second and third stanza. In this way, the main subject of the poem, that is the legend carved on the base, is described. It is the scene of the Bacchanalian procession consisting of the flute players, that youth singing under the trees, and the lover about to kiss. The scene makes the poor think the caravan life, the silent music of the marble pipe, the unuttered song, the bold lover on the point of kissing the beautiful maiden. All this imagined life is more real than the human life of audible melody and physical embrace. The lover carved on the urn is happier for he may not enjoy the fruition of love, but he would always love, and his beloved would retain her beauty forever. She cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss forever. Wilt thou love and she be fair? Then, in a higher philosophical conception, the poet expresses: heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes play on not to the sensual ear, but more endeared pipe to the spirit deities of no tone. Thus, the poet prefers spiritual enjoyment to the sensual enjoyment. In the fourth stanza, there is another scene on the urn which shows a procession which is going to sacrifice a calf. It is headed by a priest. Keats here is again chatting his voice and asks his mysterious priest about the procession. Why is the animal dressed with garlands? Why does the animal cry? The poet, in contrast to himself in preceding stanza, has kept a distance and designed a succession of effect. The poet's mind moves backward to the possible city from which the priest, the heifer, and the pupil going out to the sacrifice have come. What little town by river or seashore or mountain built with peaceful citadel is emptied of its folk this pious morn? In the answering lines, Keats gives a picture of the town which the people in the procession have vacated. The town is painted as situated near the river at the foot of a hill, and on the top there is a fortress. The town is empty. The town, Keats says, will always remain desolate, and no one will ever tell its tale. In the last stanza, we are told that the urn is a beautiful object in Greek art. Its surface is carved with many beautiful objects. There are pictures of men and women on that. It includes the carved pattern of wild branches and the grass which is walked over by three revelers. Keats mentions the urn again as a silent form and sustain the object's former association in the second line of the poem. It is in this last stanza that the poet purport to convey to his readers that it is imagination alone that can enable us to see into the life of things. Intellect can lead us nowhere. The works of art like the urn awaken our imagination and thus seduce us from thought. They are as remote and eternal as eternity itself. They lie outside the scope of ordinary thought as well as outside ordinary emotion. Hence, the urn is referred to as cold pastoral, which in a silent form does tease us out of thought as doth eternity. And then in the concluding lines the poet gives his message: beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. These concluding famous lines have been raised to an endless decision and a variety of interpretation. For Robert Bridge, they redeem a poor poem. For Queller Coach, they are an uneducated conclusion, and for T.S. Eliot, they are a serious blemish on a beautiful poem. Professor Garrod takes truth to mean reality and rightly explain the lines thus: there is nothing real but the beautiful and nothing beautiful but the real. Professor C.M. Brora narrows the application of the message by saying that it should not be taken to mean a complete philosophy of life but a theory of art, a doctrine intended to explain Keats' own creative experience. For T.S. Eliot, they are a serious blemish on the beautiful poem. Professor the lines according to C.M. Bra tells us what great art means to those who create it while they create it, and so long as this doctrine is not applied beyond its proper confines, it is not only clear but true. The conclusion according to the Hindu way hints at Satyam Shivam Sundaram, having a symbol and images. Earl Wasserman traces the poem wholly as a drama of the symbol. The images are shown developing from the beginning to the end. The very title on Grecian urn shows that it is a commentary on the object seen through artistic sensibility. Keats, keeping himself away from the urn, is observing the drama going on the urn, but at the same time the poet is experiencing the drama himself. The urn is symbolic of eternity and timelessness. It is a piece of art. All arts, poetry, music and painting can be appreciated not by thoughts or intellect but by emotion or imagination. To Keats, truth is beauty and beauty truth. If the beauty of art is searched to the very depth of speculation, truth will be found there. Saddened by the mutability of natural beauty, Keats sought consolation in the more permanent beauty of art. Funny, the evolution of Keats' poetry, heading a conclusion. In the word of C.M. Browra, the ode on a Grecian urn moves from eager curiosity to delighted amazement, exalted rapture and devout solemnity. It closes on a note akin to revelation, paradoxical clarity. The poem has more than a direct line of development. It has its contrast of height and depth and the richness which these add to it. Next question है, give the critical appreciation of the poem The Eve of St. Agnes. Answer, heading a date and occasion of the poem. The Eve of St. Agnes was written in January 1819 and revised in September. Through it, Though it assumes the form of a narrative, it is hardly a narrative, rather it is a monody of dreamy richness, a picturesque presentment of a mood and a sentiment. The poem was written when the possibility of Keats' reunion with Fanny had considerably increased. He had written to her that he loved her deeply. C.H. Return had conveyed to him that she too loved him deeply. Heading the theme and story. The theme of the poem is love. The poem is based on the medieval superstitions connected with the eve of St. Agnes, which falls on 20th January, that a young maiden who has properly fasted and prayed would have vision at midnight of her absent lover. Accordingly, Madeline keeps the fast, prays and goes to bed. Her lover Porphyro, prevented from meeting her in daylight by the hostility of their parents, stealthily enters her bedroom and elopes with her, heading the atmosphere. In dealing with the theme, Keats has recaptured the atmosphere of the Middle Ages with all its superstitions, grandeur, adventure, chivalry, and romance. The poem is in the form of a long narrative in which the poet has packed many beautiful ideas. The poem deals with a genuine passion of Porphyro and Madeline. They and what belongs to them are described in rich natural terms, usually those of crimson and the rose. Suddenly a thought came like a full-blown rose. The stained glass of Madeline's casement is colored like the wings of the tiger moth, and its emblazonings blush with the blood of queens and kings. The poem deals with fully consummated passion. The lover lies at the warm heart of the castle, secluded from the physical and moral coldness outside. Be moved from the utter chill of the natural world. The hair in the frozen grass, to the batsman, to the chapel, too old and austere for love, then to the revelry in the hall, and finally to the center, to this world of love, Madeline's room, her bed, and Madeline in it. There is then a movement outward from the warm center when the lovers escape into the night. The sources, heading है, the chief sources of the poem is the medieval legend of St. Agnes. The story derived from a romance of the Italian writer Boccaccio reminds one of the situation in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Its central scene recalls with a difference the bedchamber scene in Shakespeare's Cymbeline, which it also consciously or unconsciously echoes more than one. St. Agnes was a Roman girl who suffered martyrdom for her Christian faith. She was canonized on the 21st of January 304 AD. St. Agnes came afterwards to be regarded as the patron saint of virgins. The 21st of January is observed as the St. Agnes Day, while the 20th of January is the eve of St. Agnes. In addition to the folk tale, Keats seems to have got ideas from Brand's popular antiquities, Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, and Ben Jonson's satire. The idea of the feast in the poem seems to have been derived from the Arabian Nights entertainments and the Gothic castle from Mrs. Annie Radcliffe's romances. One only guesses his adventure with Fanny Brane, but there is a knowledge of actual circumstances from which he was not disentangled. The frozen field and the Christmas festivity at Hampstead, his medieval surroundings at Chichester, the remote quiet of Bathampton, and yet these outward circumstances of warmth and cold, youth and age, sound and silence, all counterpointed against each other. These outward circumstances project the emotion he felt at the unexpected birth of a new love in his time of sorrow of Tom's death, having a contrast and parallel. Contrast and parallel are the foundation of this poem. Light is contrasted with sad, coldness with warmth. The contrast between the stillness of Madeline's room, silken hushed and chaste, and the noisy celebration in the hall below, between the warmth of her bed and the chilly night, between the fever heat of midsummer Vermona and etching cold of Keats' Castle, are striking. In brief, the poem offers a brilliant contrast between warmth and cold, youth and age, sound and silence, having a fusion of the pagan and Christian elements. In stanza 25th, Porphyro sees all the Christian association of the word angel. She seemed a splendid angel, newly dressed. In stanza 31st, Porphyro addresses the sleeping Madeline as my seraph fair. In stanza 14, the good angels are invoked to deceive Madeline with dreams of her lover. The old Angela, urging Porphyro to leave again, refers to the good angels. The name of the old woman is Angela. All these things indicate the Christian element in the poem. In the poem, there is a reference to Virgin Mary. The batsman represents Orthodox Christianity at its most austere. If St. Agnes Eve is an occasion for hope, in the case of Madeline, it is an occasion for harsh penance for the batsman. All these references to angels are connected with one very important element in the poem, and that is its mingling of the Christian with the secular and even with the pagan. The very superstition that sends Madeline early to bed is a piece of thoroughly pagan folk belief, and as such most oddly associated with the Christian Saint Agnes. In stanza 7, we hear of Madeline's maiden eyes divine, and stanza 9 tells us how Porphyro longs to gaze and worship all unseen, perchance speak, kneel, touch, kiss. We notice how the idea of worship soon gives way to physical contrast. It is no accident that this is so, for Porphyro stands very much for the human and unsanctified. This poem is not to be regarded as an attack on Christianity or as a dismissal of paganism. Both Christianity in its pure form and Christianity in its adulterated, paganized form are part of the world on which the lovers turned their backs. Yet it would be a mistake to suppose that Keats is merely dismissing the belief that he does not share, for although Angela and the batsman may die and Madeline may be raised to a new world of reality, the storm into which the lovers fly is full of dangerous possibilities. It is not a flight into glamorous land but a step into the coldly real world. Keats does not offer the lover's flight as a triumphant escape from a world of superstition, both institutional and pagan, into an illuminated landscape in which everything is for the best. What Keats is doing is to explore in the more subtle manner the tension between the spiritual and the physical and the ambiguous nature of love. Robin में heading है symbolism. According to Jack Stillinger, a small group of critics has tried to find a deeper significance in the poem. The poem seems to dramatize certain ideas that Keats held dear to his heart before writing about the nature of imagination, the relationship between his world and the next, and the progress of an individual's ascent towards spiritualization. Another interpretation, says Jack Stillinger, is that the castle of Madeline's father allegorically represents human life, and that Porphyro, passing upward to a closest adjoining Madeline bed chamber, and from there into the chamber itself, progresses from apartment to apartment in the mansion of life, executing a spiritual ascent to heaven's boundary. Porphyro saying to the sleeping Madeline, "Thou art my heaven," and I think Eremite confirms this idea. Jack Stillinger does not agree with this point. He depicts Porphyro as villainous seducer. He also points out that no matter how much Keats entered into the feeling of his characters, he could not lose touch with the claim and responsibility of world he lived in. Adding the narration of the poem to Couto Roger Sherlock in the flow and throb of its emotion. The narrative of this poem is wrought up to the pitch of lyric intensity. Through the method is richly descriptive. Everything in the poem contributes to the isolation of the central figures, splendid in their romantic passion against the dark background of the hatred of their elder, cold heart in a cold season. Through the poem is loaded with descriptive detail. None of the pictorial passage is merely decorative. Heading the beauties of the poem. The poem is remarkable for its gorgeous decoration. The lavishness of decoration reminds us of Spenser. The poem was written under the influence of Spenser's Faerie Queene. The poem is in the Spenserian stanza, and the skillful handling of the Spenserian stanza heightens its sleepy atmosphere and imparts to it a rare melody. Its peculiar power lies in the delicate transfusion of sight and emotion into sound, in making pictures out of words or turning words into pictures, of giving a visionary beauty to the close items of description, of holding all the materials of the poem in a long drawn out suspense of music and reveries Rossetti. The poem certainly throbs with lyrical intensity, and quite possibly its result from the poet's happy mood to have Fanny love. But now where do we find the eye of the poet introducing upon the character. It is the atmosphere, the sensitive language, and the sensuous imagery that explain everything. Heading a last conclusion. However, this matchless poem, full of life and movement, rich in color and sensuous word pictures, has its own blemish. For example, the batsman and chapel, through they introduce the tale and provide contrast, have nothing to do with the main action. They are superfluous. Similarly, the banquet, which is arranged in Madeline's chamber, has no purpose and no justification. Through it may tempt the palate of the readers by its richness and flavor. The incident is so trivial and it has been made so much of for the sake of verbal embellishment that one is forced to conclude that Keats' capacity for sustained narrative was of a most feeble kind. The Eve of St. Agnes is a poem of glamour par excellence. Question 3. Write a note on Keats' sensuousness. Answer. Keats is primarily a sensuous poet. Sensuousness is a paramount bias of his genius. In fact, sensuousness is a striking characteristic of an entire poetic output. As Matthew Arnold observes, poetry, according to Milton's famous saying, should be simple, sensuous, impassioned. No one can question the eminence in Keats' poetry of the quality of sensuousness. Keats as a poet is abundantly and enchantingly sensuous. One might quote examples from his poetry to show that he was completely under the domination of his senses and was nothing else. In a letter he exclaims, "Oh, for a life of sensation rather than of thoughts." In another letter he remarks, "With a great poet the sense of beauty obliterates every other consideration." Whether Keats was to confine himself merely to the worship of beauty as perceived by the senses, or come to the realization of the beauty of human action or of human soul, is however a different question, but the fact remains that the senses held a very significant part in his perception of beauty. Heading a sense of sight. First heading, when we say that he is a poet of light foot, dark violent eyes and parted hair, soft dimpled hands, white neck and creamy breast, we only focus attention on the dominance of sight of beauty as perceived by the eyes. But in the case of Keats, it is not sight alone, not the eyes alone, but all the senses contributed to his perception of the beautiful. His poetry has rarely been equaled in description of the beauties perceptible to the senses, such as form, color, perfume, or music. It was his mission to interpret the highest type of sensuous beauty in the odd Onegration urn. The form of the urn as perceived by the eyes captures his imagination. The flowery tale, the leaf-fringed legends, the attic shape, the breed of marble men and maidens are all perceived by the eyes. Apart from love of form, the eyes led him to luxuriate like a painter in an assembly of colors. In the following lines from his Ode to Autumns to load and bless: with fruit the vines that rounds the thatched eaves run to bend, with apples the most cottage trees, the greenery of the vine leaves, the grey colour of the thatched roof of the cottage, the golden yellow of the mature apples, and the emerald moss provide a feast of varied colors to the imagination of the poet-painter. Second heading, sense of touch. What Milton's preciously meant by his definition that poetry is a sensuous art is easily classified by examples from Keats' poetry. Keats could not stay long in the domain of the abstract, and as in Spencer images, all abstraction give place to the concrete. The opening passage of the Eve of St. Agnes illustrates the point. St. Agnes Eve, a bitter chill it was. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold. The hare limbed trembling through the frozen grass. The cold touch of the chilly January night could not have been better communicated. There is the language of pure poetry, that is, poetry as a sensuous art, as Milton meant it. Haddon tells us how Keats once covered his tongue and throat as far as he could reach with shining paper in order to appreciate the delicious coldness of claret. In a letter to his sister, he mentioned a little claret wine cool out of a cellar mile deep. It is the same Keats who longed for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled long age in the deep delved earth. Cover a rosebud round the tapering end of your finger and smooth it against by thy lips. That is a simple, direct communication of our sense. Impression can have far-reaching effect on our imagination will be clear from the following passage of an essay of Robert Lynn on cold. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold, even so I envied him his feathers as I lay in bed and thought of the bleak and bitter February morning outside, into which I should before long have to go. How pleasant to be so well clad by nature as not to have to get up and dress. Third heading, sense of smell. Owing to the dense foliage of the beech trees, Keats cannot see what flowers are at his feet, but by smell he can guess each sweet plant or blossom with which the month has endowed the grass, the thicket, and the wild fruit tree, white hawthorn, and the pastoral eglantine and fast fading violet, and he can guess what soft incense hangs upon the boat in the scented darkness. The sense of smell helps him to recreate the pious atmosphere of the pagan rituals in his ode to Psyche. Incense sweet from chain swung censer teeming, both the senses of touch and smell are gratified by the perfume of fruits and syrup which he lovingly enumerates in the Eve of St. Agnes. While he from forth the closet brought a heap of candied apple, quince, then plum, and gourd with jewels smoother than the creamy curd, and lucent syrups tinged with cinnamon, manna, and dates, the grocery transferred from fudge and spiced dainties. These delicates he heaped with glowing hands on golden dishes, and in basket bright of weathered silver sumptuous they stand in the retired quiet of the night, filling the chilly room with perfume light, adding a fourth sense of taste. The tongue is one of the most sensitive organ, and in the case of Keats it was still more so, as will be evident from the closing passage of his Ode on Melancholy. Ah, in the very temple of delight, wild melancholy has her sovereign shrine, though seen of none save him whose sensuous tongue can burst joy, grape against palate fine. In Ode to a Nightingale, Keats describes the taste of the choicest wine. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true and the blissful Hippocrene. Likewise, in La Belle Dame sans Mercy, he writes, "She found me roots of relish sweet, of honey boiled and manna dew," having a fifth sense of hearing. The ear is as much an inlet of beauty as the eye to the poet. His ear missed nothing from the voice of the grasshoppers in summer, when all the words are faint with the hot suns, to the shrill cricket song on a lone winter evening. That is why the poetry of earth is never dead to him. Autumn also regales his ear with its characteristic music, beautifully mournful, the buzzing of the gnats, louder when the winds blow, more subdued when the wind ceases to blow, the plaintive bleating of the Thames standing on the hilly bourne in the fading lights of an autumnal evening, the chirping of the grasshoppers among the hedge, the soft travel of the robin in the orchard, and the twittering of the swallow exercising their wings in the sky above so as to ready for their winter migration. The Nightingale has inspired many poets from Milton to Robert Bridge, but Keats' Ode to Nightingale is deservedly the most well known. This romantic ode has made the song of the nightingale as immortal as the poet himself. The song is full-throated, but it is accompanied by perfect ease, the spontaneity of a consummate artist. The word is the dryad of the trace which had made the Beechen plot melodious, and the note is full of assertion, promise, and expectancy, and it was heard by emperor or clone in ancient times, and it had penetrated the sad heart of Ruth or gladdened the ears of a princess held in duress in a desolate castle on perilous siege, and awaiting liberation by her lover who will defy the waves for the sake of love. The nightingale makes the poet forget all the fever and the fret, and the poet passes into a blissful union with its spirit. But this divine spell unfortunately cannot last forever, and the poet is brought back to his soul self as the passionate anthems of the world faded away in the vernal valley. His perfect ear could hear the pattering of the sleet just as much as the humming of flies on summer eves. Meantime, the frost wind blows like love's alarm, patterning the sharp sleet against the window panes. Thus, it is seen that Keats is a poet of perception rather than of contemplation. In his mature poetry, particularly in the odes and in Hyperion, sensuousness is penetrated by sentiments, voluptuousness is premeditated by vitality and aestheticism is tempered by intellectualism. In Keats' palace of poetry, the nucleus is sensuous, but the superstructure has chambers of more abiding things and more permanent colors. His poetry is not a mere record of sense impression, but it is a spontaneous overflow of imagination kindled by the sense. Thanks, best of luck.